What's happening? I don't know what's happening. We're losing control of the aircraft. We've lost all control. What you're witnessing is the beginning of one of aviation's greatest mysteries. An advanced aircraft, an experienced crew, and a sudden, terrifying descent into the unknown. This is the story of Air France Flight 447. On May 31, 2009, at approximately 8 p.m. local time, Air France Flight 447 pushed back from the gate at Rio de Janeiro International Airport, Brazil. Its destination, Paris, France. The flight path crossed the Atlantic Ocean, beginning in Brazil and heading northeast toward Europe before descending into Paris. The typical duration of this journey is about 12 hours. The aircraft was an Airbus A330-200, one of the newest in Air France's fleet. It had received a major overhaul just a month before, in April 2009, and had accumulated about 19,000 flight hours at the time of the incident. It was powered by two General Electric CF6 engines, with no known mechanical issues reported. On board were 216 passengers, representing nearly 30 nationalities. The majority were French, Brazilian, or German citizens, including both business and holiday travelers. Although the Airbus A330 is designed to operate with two pilots, Air France procedures require a third pilot for long-haul flights exceeding 10 hours. For the 13-hour duty time of the Rio to Paris route, including pre-flight tasks, a three-pilot crew was assigned. Captain Marc Dubois, 58 years old, with nearly 11,000 flight hours, over 6,000 as captain, and 1,700 hours on the A330. Relief First Officer David Robert, 37, seated on the left side, with 6,000 plus flight hours, including 4,500 on the A330. First Officer Pierre-Cedric Bonin, 32, seated on the right, with almost 3,000 hours, though only 87 on the A330. At approximately 8:30 p.m., the aircraft departed normally, climbing steadily according to standard procedure and setting course for its transatlantic journey. At around 20,000 feet, the relief first officer left the cockpit to begin his 3-hour rest period. The captain moved to the left seat and the first officer to the right. Soon, they reached their cruising altitude of FL 350, 35,000 feet. The first part of the flight was routine and uneventful. Around 1:35 a.m., the plane entered oceanic airspace over the Atlantic Ocean, northeast of the South American coastline. During this time of the year, the Mid-Atlantic region is known for heavy weather conditions caused by the Intertropical Convergence Zone (ITC), a belt of low pressure near the equator where the trade winds of both hemispheres meet. This area is notorious for its thunderstorms, with frequent heavy rain, turbulence, and limited radar visibility. These storms often appear weaker than they truly are due to their low lightning activity, especially at night. That makes it harder for pilots to assess the real severity using onboard weather radar. As the automated systems manage flight operations, the crew's main role was to monitor instruments and use radar to avoid severe weather. During this phase, the aircraft encountered tropical showers and mild thunderstorms, with weak to moderate updrafts and a high chance of turbulence. The crew discussed a possible climb to FL 370, 37,000 feet, to rise above the weather system. However, warmer air at that altitude made climbing unfeasible. Warm air is less dense, making it harder for an aircraft to generate sufficient lift, especially in turbulence. To enhance visibility, the pilots dimmed the cockpit lights and turned on the landing lights. It looks like we're entering cloud cover. It would have been good to climb. Now it's going to be turbulent for my rest. At 2 a.m., the relief first officer returned to the cockpit after his break. The captain then left for his own rest period, but without providing a proper handover or briefing. Now the first officer, Bonin, was flying the aircraft from a right seat, while the relief first officer, Robert, sitting in the left seat, assumed the role of pilot in command during the captain's absence. Bonin updated Robert about their inability to climb and the expected turbulence ahead, similar to what they'd recently experienced. 6 minutes later, the two first officers informed the cabin crew of turbulence expected in 2 minutes. The turbulence turned out to be moderate, despite the autopilot being engaged. During this time, The bank angle fluctuated between approximately 3 degrees to the right and 5 degrees to the left. To enhance weather awareness, the first officer adjusted the radar gain to increase its sensitivity and suggested a deviation to the left. The aircraft was turned 12 degrees left of its planned route to avoid the worst of the weather. 2 minutes later, the aircraft encountered an updraft, and a distinctive sound, like ice crystals hitting the fuselage, was heard. These ice crystals began entering the pitot tubes, which normally wouldn't be an issue. However, at high concentrations, the crystals can clog the pitot tubes faster than the heaters can melt them. The Airbus A330 is equipped with 3 pitot tubes, one each for the captain, first officer, and the standby instruments. These tubes measure the pressure of the oncoming air and compare it to the static pressure to calculate airspeed, which is then used to derive other vital parameters like Mach number, vertical speed, and altitude. These values are displayed in real time to the flight crew. However, when ice clogged all 3 pitot tubes, air could no longer enter, causing a drop in measured pressure. As a result, the indicated airspeed dropped rapidly, from 275 knots to 139 knots. This sudden data loss triggered a chain reaction of malfunctions. The autopilot disconnected. The flight director bars disappeared. The aircraft's flight control loss switched from normal to alternate, which disabled several protections, including angle of attack protection, overspeed protection, bank angle protection. The aircraft became much more sensitive to manual roll inputs. "I have the controls," said the first officer as the aircraft rolled to the right. He took over manual control and began applying nose-up and left roll inputs. The auto-thrust system also disengaged, switching to thrust lock mode, freezing the engine power setting at 83%. The aircraft's pitch attitude rose to 6 degrees, and vertical speed increased to 1,800 feet per minute, which triggered the stall warning. A stall occurs when an aircraft's wings can no longer produce enough lift to sustain flight, typically due to too high an angle of attack and/or low airspeed. The first officer struggled with the bank angle, over-controlling it with alternating left and right inputs. His control inputs were out of sync with the aircraft's roll motion, creating a cycle of instability. Over the next 30 seconds, he slowly managed to stabilize the roll, which temporarily silenced the stall warning. Moments later, the standby airspeed reading dropped again, from 270 to 73 knots. The aircraft's pitch increased to 11 degrees, and its climb rate spiked to 6,000 feet per minute. The first officer continued applying nose-up inputs, raising the pitch attitude to 16 degrees. A series of small roll oscillations began again, and the first officer countered each with lateral stick inputs. The stall warning reactivated. Amidst the chaos, the crew attempted to call the captain back to the cockpit by ringing the chime in the rest area. The aircraft reached a critical angle of attack, leading to aerodynamic shaking, a classic sign of an approaching or active stall. Thrust was increased to 2/GA, takeoff/go-around power. However, the first officer kept applying nose-up inputs, which maintained a shallow climb, exacerbating the stall. "Above all, try to touch the lateral controls as little as possible," someone advised. Despite that, rolling continued, and the first officer used full left and right stick inputs to counteract the movements. Eventually, the ice melted, and all 3 airspeed indicators began displaying correct values, around 180 knots. However, it became obvious that the aircraft was flying too slowly for its altitude. A normal cruise speed at that level would have been around 260 knots. Seconds later, the aircraft reached a maximum altitude of nearly 38,000 feet, a 3,000-foot climb in just over a minute since the autopilot had disconnected. The bank angle shifted to the right, and despite the first officer applying full left stick, it had little effect. "I don't have control of the aircraft anymore. I don't have control at all." The relief first officer also applied full left inputs twice. The first officer held the side stick full left and fully back for nearly 40 seconds, causing the descent rate to increase to 10,000 feet per minute. The aircraft's pitch remained high, between 10 degrees and 16 degrees, nose up. About 2 minutes after the autopilot disengaged, the captain re-entered the cockpit. By now, indicated airspeeds dropped below 60 knots, making the angle of attack sensors unreliable, which silenced the stall warning. As speeds fell under 30 knots, a red SPD flag replaced the airspeed indication. Despite the first officer's full left control input, the aircraft tilted sharply to the right, with bank angles reaching up to 45 degrees. What are you doing? What's happening? I don't know what's happening. We're losing control of the aircraft. We've lost all control. The pitch attitude fluctuated between 8 degrees and 15 degrees, nose up. The thrust levers were pulled back to idle, and the nose briefly pitched down. Each time the nose lowered, the angle of attack decreased slightly, and the airspeed reappeared. Then, once again, the stall warning activated. Reactivated. I have the impression that we have some crazy speed, said the first officer. In response, he deployed the speed brakes, which caused the aircraft's nose to pitch up, leveling with the horizon. The relief first officer advised him not to use the speed brakes, and they were promptly retracted. As a result, the nose dropped again to 8 degrees below the horizon before pitching back up. The aircraft continued its rapid descent, with vertical speeds between 10,000 and 15,000 feet per minute. The thrust levers were set to climb power, and for the first time in over a minute, the wings briefly leveled out, indicating a momentary return to straight and level flight. However, this was short-lived. The aircraft resumed swaying left and right, prompting the first officer to apply significant side stick movements to counteract the rolling and stabilize the aircraft. As they descended through 20,000 feet, the thrust levers were advanced from the climb to tentatoga, takeoff/go around. Soon after, the aircraft began rolling right again. The first officer applied full left side stick input and held it for 20 seconds. We're there, we're passing level 100, someone remarked. By that point, the aircraft had already descended 28,000 feet. Wait, I have the controls, the relief first officer said, making a left stick input for about 7 seconds. However, the first officer never released his own side stick input. How come we're continuing to go down? The relief first officer asked. He then instructed the captain to attempt a reset of the flight control computers to see if it might help. The captain, skeptical, replied that it would not do anything, but he proceeded to reset both the primary and secondary flight control computers regardless. 9,000 feet. Climb. I've been at max nose up for a while. No, don't climb, so go down. The relief first officer pushed his stick forward while the thrust levers were pulled back to climb power. However, the first officer continued to pull back on his side stick. This triggered the dual input warning. Me. The controls to me. Go ahead, you have the controls. The relief first officer lowered the nose to 7 degrees below the horizon. The airspeed indications and stall warning reappeared. Just 7 seconds later, despite the relief first officer having the controls, the first officer began pulling back again. Dual input was announced once more, and the aircraft began pitching up. Dual input. Watch out. Up. I'm pitching up. The thrust levers were briefly pulled back to idle for 2 seconds, and the aircraft's nose pitched up to 16 degrees. You're pitching up. Well, we need to. We are at 4,000 feet. Seconds later, as the aircraft descended through 2,500 feet, the Ground Proximity Warning System, GPWS, alarm sounded in the cockpit. Pull up. The thrust levers were pushed to toga, and both pilots applied nose-up inputs. The aircraft pitched up again towards 16 degrees. Then, the first officer pressed the takeover button on his side stick, overriding the relief first officer's inputs. We're going to crash. This can't be true. The aircraft, having dropped from 38,000 feet to sea level in just 3 minutes and 30 seconds, crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. Tragically, all passengers and crew on board lost their lives, marking one of the darkest days in aviation history. Let us pause to reflect on the profound impact of this event and remember those who were lost before moving on to the investigation. Investigation. Shortly after 4 a.m., when Flight 447 failed to make contact with air traffic control in either Senegal or Cape Verde, a controller in Senegal attempted to establish communication. Despite repeated efforts, there was no response. Brazil and Senegal alerted search and rescue services, initiating a mission to locate the missing aircraft. The challenge: Flight 447 had vanished in an area with no radar coverage, limited radio communication, and no eyewitnesses. 2 days later, a Brazilian aircraft spotted what appeared to be an oil slick and light floating debris. A few days after that, search teams discovered 2 bodies, along with personal belongings. The final resting place of Flight 447 was found on April 3, 2011, at a depth of nearly 4,000 meters. By May 10, both black boxes had been recovered and sent to France's Air Safety Agency, the BEA, for analysis. In July 2012, the BEA published its final report on the accident. The investigation concluded that a temporary discrepancy in measured airspeeds, likely caused by the obstruction of the pitot probes by ice crystals, had initiated the crisis. This caused the autopilot to disengage and shifted the aircraft's flight control mode from normal to alternate law, disabling several protections including angle of attack, over speed, and bank angle limits. Without these protections, the aircraft became more reactive to control inputs. According to standard procedures, the pilots were expected to diagnose the situation quickly and respond with pitch and thrust stabilization. However, because the failure occurred unexpectedly during cruise flight, it caught the pilots off guard. This led to excessive roll inputs and an abrupt nose-up pitch, which caused the aircraft to enter a sustained stall, marked by a continuous stall warning and severe buffeting. The stall warning sounded for 54 seconds continuously, but the crew did not recognize it or attempt a stall recovery maneuver. This failure to recover was likely due to a lack of specific training. While the training complied with regulations, it was not sufficient. Manual aircraft handling, particularly in high-altitude stall situations, requires calm, measured inputs and cannot be improvised under stress. The BEA's investigation of training records revealed that the co-pilots had not been trained to manually handle the aircraft during approach to stall and stall recovery at high altitude. Recommendations. In light of its findings, the BEA issued several safety recommendations. Revise training and check programs to include mandatory stall approach and recovery drills, even at cruise altitude. Mandate image recorders for aircraft conducting public transport flights to capture full views of the instrument panel. Improve pitot tube designs, crew resource management in augmented crews, and implement angle of attack indicators in cockpits. Enhance flight recorders, task sharing procedures, and high-altitude manual handling protocols. Conclusion. Ultimately, no single explanation can fully account for the actions of the crew. However, it is clear that insufficient training and misinterpretation of the situation played critical roles. Even for non-pilots, the tragedy of Air France Flight 447 offers valuable lessons about aviation safety, human factors, and the importance of ongoing learning. Let us honor those who were lost by continuing to learn from these events and working towards safer skies for all.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more aviation content. Let's keep learning and make the skies safer together.